Breakout was really early. Yeah, it's a ball and paddle game, right? And it was a brilliant idea for Nolan to do that. I mean, he had a lot of ideas, and he was the guy that went around me and corralled Jobs into designing this, not knowing that Jobs wasn't an engineer and couldn't do that. And Jobs wasn't about to tell him, but his buddy was, who was just the sweetest, brightest savant. And I come in and Steve Jobs says, hey, look at this. And here is a finished game, Breakout, that was not under development. Understand, typical games took a few months to develop. It was like, got dropped in from outer space, finished game, working prototype. What? And Jobs says, yeah, he claimed he designed it. And I go, no, he didn't, bullshit. And I found out later that because Woz was coming in at night, he's working at HP, and he liked HP, but Atari was a lot more fun. So I go in and there's a finished game. I'm going, what the f***? This is crazy. You heard the story. I'll tell you my version because I've seen some different numbers, but as I understand it, Nolan said he would give Jobs a bonus of $1,000 a chip for every chip less than 50 that he was able to do this with. Now, knowing that this had more objects and stuff than Pong did, and Pong was 76 chips, it's a pretty safe bet that Nolan's not going to have to pay a penny for this, right? Again, Woz is one of the most gifted, brilliant men engineering. Woz designs it with like 24 chips. Now, Nolan didn't say you had to be able to buy the chips. So some of the chips were chips out of Hewlett-Packard that you couldn't get. But there was the prototype of the working game. And you look at a schematic and I couldn't understand, how would this thing work?
Vectors are amazing things, right? Like the fact that vector graphics were phenomenal and they continue to hold up really well. So I think when we look at Tempest or Tempest 2000 or Tempest 4000, I feel like those games of all of the games, those old games have aged the best. Not Tempest specifically, but the vector-based games, and Tempest just being a really incredibly strong example of a vector-based game because it still looks beautiful.
Aesthetically, I just think Tempest is a timeless game. Asteroids is a timeless game.
The old CRTs, the cathode ray tubes, had a beam that would go back and go across the screen very fast, and it would draw the line. So you drew that always. So that was always being drawn, and you could turn on and off the beam, or beams if it's color, red, green, blue in color, and create an image. Vector doesn't do that. Vector, you actually draw the lines. So there is no raster going on. The beam isn't doing this down the screen. If you want to draw a red line that goes like that, you put the beam there and you push it across the screen to there. So you are actually doing an Etch-a-Sketch is the best way to think about it.
One of the interesting limitations and why it's so good for space games on Vector is if you don't draw something, the screen is black. It's not kind of sort of gray, it's black.
If the hardware stopped in a coin-op game, the last picture would stay there. If hardware stops in a vector generator, it goes black. Because you have to draw it. You're drawing the beams, there's no raster. There's nothing automatic in that. And I like that as well. That meant I could draw something and I didn't have to worry about it again. If I wanted to move it, I just redrew it over here. Before, you have to erase it from that space and rewrite it over here. Yeah, didn't like that. Too much work.
The limitation isn't how many dots you have, it's how many inches of light you have. And a lot of people really love that white on black look.
You could get these really fine details for the time. I mean, if you go back and look at it now, it's not as high res as you think it is, but the ships and the shots and the way it looked, and you could adjust the brightness on an individual item, you know, that bright shot in Asteroids, for example, when that goes across the screen. There's nothing like that. It's just an amazing look, and I wanted to work on it.
We started with black and white. I worked a little bit on Battlezone when I worked on the simulator, which was after Battlezone came out, but if you remember Battlezone, it was green. Those weren't green lines, that was a green template that was over the top that made it green.
I got color when I did Space Duel, which I took over from another programmer who, for some reason, just kind of lost it and left the company and kind of evolved it from what he had started. I wanted more time to work on it, and another programmer was working on Asteroids Deluxe, and I was doing color Asteroids. That's what I was doing with it. That's what Space Duel originally started, as color Asteroids. And they said, oh, you know, we're not going to do that because Asteroids Deluxe just came out. So they gave the hardware and some of the code I did to Dave Toyer, and he did Tempest. And then some of that came back, and I did Space Duel. So you'll see things that are similar that cross through it.
So Vector Sector was born out of the idea of what if all of Atari's vector games existed in the same universe? And we went from there. It was great to talk to Owen Rubin, who created Major Havoc, Space Duel. And when he played Vector Sector, he got through the asteroids phase and he got to Lunar Lander, and he was like, oh, you should do this with linked ships. And he didn't know that we'd done that. So that was like a thrill. Also, when we got to the end of the game, we played a linked duel multiplayer game. We got to the end and he was having a conversation with me. He glanced up and he saw that we had his initials in the high scores as a default high score. And he just threw out a, oh, thanks. Yeah, thought that was cool.
Well, at the beginning, it was sort of forbidden to consort with the enemy.
First off, we had a vibrant coin-op business that was making money and keeping us in business, and consumer wasn't making anything. I didn't want to screw with that. I did not want to damage that.
There was a door that said, don't even think about entering here. And I was like, I work for this company. I opened the door and walked in, and Al turned around and goes, what are you doing in here? Who the hell are you? Why are you here? And so I said, well, I work for this company. What are you guys doing?
Oh, and found out how to open the door between the two places. And what's this? And I'm going, what the hell are you doing? Anyway, we became friends.
I was one of the few people in coin-op that spent a lot of time in the consumer group, sort of going back and forth.
I believe that Al Alcorn was sincerely concerned that coin-op would be a distraction on his group, which we're doing a very ambitious project on a very tight schedule.
The other companies like Bally all of a sudden took some of their engineers in coin-op, and first off, I didn't think these were the right kind of engineers to do consumer. It's a different cost accounting, a different culture. Number two, I didn't want to screw with coin-op success.
The arcade games were pretty much in one area, and the consumer people were in another area.
Engineering was upstairs for consumer products. We were downstairs, and I only knew a few of them, you know, and it was because we water skied together.
There really was two separate companies, it felt like at a time. They had very different development environment. There was no synergy between the two really, other than that we shared games.
I have been known to joke that the point of coin-op games is primarily selling players their own adrenaline. So you want an intense, fast-pitch game, and you'll blame yourself if it's over in 3 minutes, not the game. A person who pays 20, 30, 40, 50 bucks for a cartridge wants to milk that thing. So the games themselves are different.
Every machine is state of the art. It's all new, fresh, challenging stuff, and it's exciting, and it's real design.
Coin-op gets to use more expensive hardware. They get to use tons and tons of hardware, and they get to refresh their hardware all the time, right? So what's happening is the Atari 2600 chip, the 6502, is a chip you could make in '76. Now Moore's Law is cruising along, doubling computer power every 3 years. But we're using a chip from '76.
Every couple of years, a new console would come out. And Atari just had to live with the old technology, but fortunately with programmers figuring out new ways to use it.
But for me, there was no rivalry. It was, they made games and they were interesting ideas, and a lot of them we were going to have to try and copy.
What happened though was as the VCS really started to make distribution and really started to get out there, and some games really started to catch on, it became apparent that the profit potential from the home games was actually much higher than it was in coin-op. So I'll tell you another pecking order sign that goes on, which raises a lot of interesting things, both financially and emotionally, is the idea of royalties. Because one big difference between VCS and coin-op was coin-op people got royalties. They got some kind of bonus participation in the success of their games, which VCS people didn't. That got to be a sore point, not between coin-op and engineering, but between VCS and management. And it's like, why aren't we doing that?
Atari had a bonus plan that was based on how your game sold. And then the consumer group wanted their own bonus plan based on how their game sold. So they would take a game designed by the 𝐀𝐭𝐫𝐲 that was in the arcade, they'd make a 2600 cartridge out of it, it would do really well, they get big bonuses, and we weren't included at all. So there was this kind of like, wait a minute, why are they taking our ideas and we're not included? That was resolved later.
Everybody, you know, identifies as the hero of their own narrative. You know, when you start checking the narratives against each other, that's when you find some interesting differences. And it wasn't, I never felt that 𝐀𝐭₈ people lorded over us, and I don't think we felt like second-class citizens, but it was well known that 𝐀𝐭₈ was working on hotter technology, doing cooler stuff, and we were trying to keep up with a technology that was falling farther and farther and farther behind. That's just the reality of it.
They both needed each other, and that's the way most of us looked at it. It was a collaboration, not a competition.
My name is Evelyn Cito. I was a graphic designer at Atari, both in the coin-operated division and the consumer division. I majored in graphic design while I was in college, and when I finished, I went back to LA and helped in my family's business, which was a restaurant business. And when I returned, a friend of mine was working at Opera & Harrington, and she was moving on to another position. And so she had me interview with George Opperman, and I was able to come on board on his staff as a production artist. During that time, which is when I started with George, it was the early 70s, and Silicon Valley was just barely a term that was barely coming up. Nolan Bushnell had his company 𝐀𝐧𝐧𝐢, a gaming company, and he needed to change the name of the company. George 𝐏𝐸𝐴, one of his colleagues, suggested that he speak to George Opperman. So I remember them coming in, and George he took on the assignment of redesigning the logo for 𝐀𝐧𝐧𝐢. And they gave him the name Atari. And so, you know, I remember George doodling on his desk. Yeah, he was just doing little doodles, and, you know, from there, you know, he maybe selected a few of them to show Nolan, and they, you know, they picked the one that they did, which is the one with the Fuji and the Atari. And back then, everything was done by hand. There was no computers. Everything was, you had to ink, and you had to spec type and order type, and then paste it all up on a board. So yeah, everything was kind of handcrafted back then. And so yeah, that was my first position, was with George doing production art. And so once they decided on which one they were going to do, I got the assignment of ordering the type and inking the Fuji. So that was my first jobs in working with Atari, was to ink that Fuji. Nolan liked names that started with A's because they were at the front of the alphabet. And because also at the time Pong was our main product, the main product. Now George says he liked the idea of it sweeping because the Pong blip would sweep, right? So that's George's. There are people who attribute that to George. George 𝐏𝐸𝐴 doesn't believe that was true. But so I honestly don't know where it came from, because obviously he didn't tell me. He just said, here, ink this up. So part of it is probably an A, and part of it is the sweep. It's probably all of that could be true. So whatever it was, it's definitely stood the test of time. And he picked the hairy type font for the Atari, and I think that's actually stood the test of time as well. Shortly after that, I left George, so that was like in '71, and I left in '72. And so George probably continued working with Atari at the time. I had moved on to another company, and in 1976, George called me and asked me, told me he was giving up his company, and he was going to go inside at Atari and become their full-time art director. And he needed an assistant, and asked me if I would be interested in doing that. I kind of thought of it as a placeholder, actually. I wasn't sure how long I would do this, and not being that familiar with the company. But anyway, I said, okay, you know. So we were in this little cubby hole. Our two desks were facing each other. And basically we had a drawing board each, and George was doing all the graphics and all the advertising and whatever that was required. George himself was an illustrator as well as a designer, as well as a marketing guy, as well as a copywriter. So he would write all the copy, and he would write all the promotional materials for Atari. So he was an in-house advertising agency. Because I wasn't an illustrator, so the things that didn't require illustration, he would, I would work on some of those, or I would collaborate with one of the illustrators. I might come up with a concept, and then one of the illustrators would design the graphic for me, like in Superbug or in Golf. Bob Flamani was the artist on those particular pieces, and so, but the concept of how it looked, the general concept might be mine, but then I would basically have the illustrator do it, which is not unusual because a lot of graphic designers are not illustrators. I worked on Superbug, I worked on Fire Truck, which was a two-man game. And see, because those graphics I could deal with, they weren't, it didn't require me to illustrate a person or an animal, so I could do graphic things, but I wasn't able to do illustrations. And I did do football, and or the soccer game that was created from that. And then when Atari got into pinball, I worked on a concept for the Wonder Woman pinball game, and that didn't require me to be such an conceptual illustrator because I already had reference material to work with in terms of the comic series. And so eventually we grew to a staff of about eight people. And we had a production artist, but George was still doing all the advertising and the brochures and all the marketing materials for any of the games that came up. And so eventually the company grew, and I stayed there for a couple of years, and ultimately decided that I had an opportunity to go. In 1977, Atari was already working on the consumer video game system. And I had heard about it but didn't know a whole lot about it. I got asked if I would like to join the consumer group. And so I went ahead and did that. And that's where I felt at home, because then I can focus on graphic design more than illustration. That was a great opportunity for me to really focus on branding. They were starting to introduce some other game systems, and so they wanted to figure out how to market it, and we wanted to take a look at what kind of packaging design do we want to go with, because at the time the VCS system was a black background with little vignettes of game players and parents and screen grabs of some of the video games. And so we decided to take a look at what we could do with it. The video computer system was sort of a generic name, and so we decided to maybe focus on blowing up the name Atari. So we made some mock-ups to do that. Basically, on a product shelf, you got 3 seconds to grab somebody's attention. We banded the box with Atari with the number of the game system, and we created some packaging and took it to a store to see how it would stand up next to the competition. And at the time, Odyssey was out, Magnavox, 𝐀𝐭𝐫𝐢, there were other game systems out there, and they were similar in design to what we had already created. So we took it to a store and took some photographs, and with the other competition in the background, it was clear that the Atari, branding big was the way to go. It's like, hello, why didn't we think of that sooner? but obviously somebody didn't think of it before we did. And then at the same time, I think Star Wars came out, and so we thought, well, gee, the space age was coming about, And so maybe we should look at, maybe color isn't the way to go. So they wanted to see what else we could do to make it look more space agey. So we came up with the silver concept of the packaging, and ultimately that's the way we went. At the time, our cartridge boxes were all real colorful and rainbow. The rainbow stripes seemed to be sophisticated enough and give it some color. And so from that, I thought it went underneath the silver band on all the boxes, so it seemed to work for that. And I think that was sort of a nod to the fact that, okay, we still have, the rainbow was sort of a nod to all the color boxes. The Fuji's always stayed there, and I think the typefaces always stay there. Although some people have played around with the typeface a little bit, but you know, you can't change it. It looks, it's a classic.
The main theme of Berserk, as I understand it, and as I've always understood it, is basically you're one of the last humans trying to escape this prison inhabited by robots. Because there's this character in the game called Evil Otto, and he bounces at you with this smiley face, but it's so sinister because all he's really trying to do is just pulverize you to like nothing. And he comes at you so aggressively. Even back in the day, the story got around really fast that somebody died playing Berserk.
The rumblings of rumors when it got out, like, oh my gosh, someone died while playing Berserk. They must have, I don't know if the game shot back at them, I don't know what happened.
And I think that added to the mystique of the game, because could this game kill you? But in reality, as far as I understand, it was somebody who actually had a heart condition who happened to be playing Berserk when an episode occurred, but that of course got embellished to this game will kill you.
I remember Berserk coming out for the 2600 and I was very impressed. The characters were very simple, but moved exactly like the arcade. The gameplay was great. I thought it was one of the great Atari cartridges, up there with Space Invaders in that time frame of arcade ports.
One of my favorite games on the 2600 happened to be Berserk. I thought it was really well produced. It didn't look like other Atari games where they flickered a lot. The characters were really solid, everything looked great, and it was a really great representation of the arcade game.
Yeah, the gameplay was well tweaked, which is not given the credibility that it should. The amount of tweaking that gameplay requires to make an excellent game, to make a truly great game, it's unappreciated.
Oh my God,
yeah.
Is it?
When I was learning, or basically teaching myself how to program the Atari 2600, as one does, I started to dabble with audio, and I had seen somebody had replicated synthesized voice on the 2600. And so that kind of occurred to me that it would be really cool to take that approach and that concept and apply it to Berserk to have the perfect version of Berserk for the Atari 2600. That set in motion my desire to just like pursue relentlessly putting voice into 2600 Berserk. And then my understanding of the arcade game is there's a specific speech synthesis chip that was used for the game. And to compare that to the 2600, there's no such thing on the 2600. And so in order to get speech to even sound similar to that chip, you have to apply all of Atari 2600's resources to it. So in order to get the sample to play back fast enough, you have to do things like don't display the screen. So the screen goes black so you can get a cleaner and more audible sound out of the processor, the sound processor. Some of the changes that I had applied to the game early on were mostly palette related and some graphical changes. Also added a title screen. I always felt that like later Atari 2600 games that had title screens were really cool, so I wanted this to feel like those. But ultimately that was where my work ended. But then the community hopped in after that release, and Dennis DeBro particularly found out by disassembling the game that there was actually code for the robots to shoot diagonally like in the arcade game. I found it fascinating that after I dabbled a little bit with Berserk, to watch other people go in and find all these other things within the source code that I missed completely, and started to apply that to like what would become ultimately Berserk Voice Enhanced.
So I started collecting on the 2600 when I was working at Looking Glass in Cambridge, Massachusetts, with Rex Bradford, who had actually worked for Activision and Parker Brothers back in the day. And that inspired me. It's like, I should go pick up a 2600 and then start buying all those games I could never afford as a kid.
So I started looking on eBay to regain my old 2600 library, whatever. And in my searching, I found the Stella List. The Stella List was a collection of programmers that were interested in programming the VCS.
I think everybody who got into homebrew pretty early in the 2600 was a member of the Stella List, and that's where everybody shared their findings on the 2600. And of course, the original developer documentation that was at Atari was scanned and provided through the list. A lot of source code for demos, like audio demos, sprite demos, playfield demos, and all stuff kind of passed through the Stella mailing list.
That was where all the activity was for development for a long time before forums really came along.
Whenever I needed help or if I had a problem, the team on the Stella List were there to help me get past my problems.
And it was almost all this technical discussion on how to develop for the Atari 2600, picking apart the machine and learning, the internals, because the 2600 is a very arcane machine and difficult to develop for.
It feels like it took me a year just to understand how to get playfield graphics on the screen.
And there's always new people coming into the hobby wanting to learn how to program. So yeah, it's been amazing to watch, and there's just so much development, hardware and software, on all these platforms on Atari Age.
In my mind, 2600 programming is as raw as it gets. It kind of shows people all your flaws. And so I'm really nervous about sharing things on the Atari Age forums. I have in the past, and I've received some great feedback, but ultimately at the end of the day, for me, I feel so inadequate when I post things there, because there's so many smart people who are way smarter than me, doing just incredible things, and I always feel like what I'm posting is just like a friend of mine used to say, it feels baby school.
But on the Atari Age forum, they have a 2600 programmer forum that you can go to. Yeah, anyone is willing to just jump in and help you.
There's a number of really talented programmers still doing wonders on the 2600.
That part of the Stella List lives on the Atari Age forum. Absolutely.
When we started Atari Age, back in 2000, we worked on 2000, opened it in 2001. Atari really wasn't paying attention to this growing community of people who are basically celebrating the brand.
I don't think there was any time during those years when homebrew really started to take off for the Atari consoles that Atari at that time felt in any way threatened.
I don't think they knew we existed. and I don't think they cared. I just don't think they cared.
I think most of the time they just kind of ignored it.
But Adventure 2, when it started out, was not endorsed by Atari in any way. And when they got wind of it, it came very close to shutting the project down. But they were able to work together, and now it is an IP that is approved by Atari. And now the community, they can play it. I mean, it was a great piece of work.
At some point, you realize, well, Atari Age, costs money to run. It's running on like a dedicated server with the forum and the games database. We can, instead of having ads on the website, we can just start publishing games ourselves. So it just went really slowly first. And one of the first games was Mike Micah's Berserk voice enhanced.
And ultimately, it was the information I gathered from shared resources in the homebrew community that led me to adapt Berserk's voice.
And from there, it just kind of blossomed, and a small group of home developers, including Thomas Jentz, allowed me to start publishing their games in the Atari Age store.
Kurt Bendel was working with Atari and did the first flashback. It wasn't exactly what he envisioned, but it was the starting point, and that was his whole plan, as I understand it. It's like, let me get in the door with this, and then I can produce what I wanted. That was the flashback too. In doing that and contracting with Atari, Kurt reached out to homebrew developers because he wanted to showcase, hey, not only do you have these classics here, but you have people that are still programming for this unit, and he wanted to show that. I was one of the homebrew developers that he reached out to. I'm honored that he reached out to me on that.
I had the fortune of knowing Kurt Vendel years and years ago. I met him at this trade show. Well, it was like a fan show called World of Atari. And it was in '98, I believe. And it was pretty clear he knew a lot about Atari. And not only that, he had a lot of ephemera from the old Atari days. And so we became fast friends. And a lot of the early Digital Eclipse projects that we worked on, Kurt helped us out. And he found the information we needed. He helped us figure out how things worked. He was an incredible hardware guy, incredible software guy. And he was so hell-bent on getting the story right. And so I give a lot of credit to Kurt for paving the way, for giving people the understanding of like where the real heroes were in those old days at Atari.
A lot of games were in development at Atari when the market crashed in '94, and a lot of them were done or very close to being done, and not just for the 2600, but also the 5200. A lot of these prototypes are being discovered during this time period, and there were various people who were creating packaging for them that would be reminiscent of, hey, what if Atari published it? What if Fox published this game? What would it look like? And you'd have a line of people at the Classic Gaming Expo on Saturday or Sunday to get their copy of the game, and they would sell out back then. And, they're $50, $60 a piece, but, they look great. They look like this is what real sports basketball we never released, but, there's a really nice community-produced reproduction of it. They come from all over. Sometimes they come from the original developers who were working at Atari, took copies of those with them, thankfully, before they were thrown out, and they were nice enough to they either sell them or loan them out so people can actually dump them and then preserve them indefinitely. And then Atari sent out a lot of lab loaner carts, basically like cartridges of games that were going to be released, like sending them to magazines in advance. Especially magazines back then had a really long lead time of months, so you'd want to get those games to the magazines so they could test them and then have an article ready, by the time the game comes out. So that's where a lot of the cartridges come from. They had a unique lab loaner label, returned to somebody at Atari with the name handwritten on the label. I'm sure you've seen them. Even now, there's still prototypes being unearthed, which is just remarkable that so long, after all this time has passed, we're still finding new games that either we never knew about or knew about and just didn't think existed. But people are finding them still. When you think of the 80s and video games, Atari is the company that comes to mind. And because, those people grew up with, there's a lot of nostalgia today still for the brand. And I think that's the main reason why, you see people so passionate about Atari.
When we do our best, video games are an art form. What we're doing doesn't just distract people or pass the time. We leave them with something.
The brand was so iconic for so long that it feels like it was a part of their life, and that it felt like a part of their identity. So I think whenever Atari over the years has done something against those core values of what people have brought to Atari and how they feel they fit with Atari, that's why you'd see a lot of vocal retaliation to what Atari was doing, because it was so personal to them.
And Atari did a great job with marketing. They had a lot of the arcade hits, like Pac-Man and Defender, and just tons of arcade games that people wanted to play at home. And they just did a great job with marketing, getting the systems out there, and that's what people remember from those early days.
For me, it is the excitement that I had as a young teenager having the VCS. That excitement is still there for me. And you've heard this before, you never forget your first love. That would be the VCS for me.
I think video games are proving to be more and more like the music business. Whatever you heard at certain points in your life of music, that's the soundtrack for your life. And when you hear those songs, when you were a kid or when you were a teen or when you were in college, it brings back those memories, and you're attached to that time and to that version of yourself, and the music takes you back there.
I think for a lot of people, it was the very first system that they had, especially for the 2600. And even then, the Pong systems that came before that, and Atari was active in arcades as well. I think the combination of, the home consoles, arcades, and then computers, that kind of trifecta really kept Atari in everyone's minds, versus the other companies only had like a console, home console, and didn't do the other things.
I took my 8-bit 800XL with me to college, and that's what I wrote my reports on. Now, granted, everybody in the dorm down the hall heard it pecking on the, the 1027, but hey, I did my reports on it.
There were people who dedicated their lives to just making sure that an Atari 800 could stay working. And they would sell parts as cheap as they could to people to keep their machines working. And so for, I'd say like 3 decades, basically you've had all these kind of like unknown people working behind the scenes just to keep Atari alive.
Millions of people grew up with these consoles. They enjoyed them. You know, their first interaction with video games for a lot of people and computers. And, you know, and Atari made a ton of great arcade games as well that are very memorable. So again, I think all of that just helped to keep the brand alive, even when Atari wasn't very active.
Ultimately, I think Atari, the name, was what survived, but not Atari, the game company. It was a different game company. It was really just Atari by name. And so we were left with a huge community of people who grew up with the Atari. It was a very personal thing for them that felt like they were being abandoned by the namesake in some ways. And so they were the ones who were the torchbearers. These are people who kept Atari alive.
I was in Europe, in Germany, and I was waiting for some friends, and all of a sudden this person comes walking by in a bright green, Kelly green shirt with a white Atari across it. And then later on, I was at the Gap store at Christmas time, and I saw a multicolored Atari t-shirt for children, and I said, well, I kind of chuckled to myself, and I said, Jesus, Atari is just not going to go away. And then of course I had to buy the shirt for my great nephew. So
after the success of the Atari VCS, Mattel as a toy company looked at this and said, maybe we should consider getting into this business.
They started their Mattel Electronics division, releasing handheld games. Their handheld football, which was an LED game, was a smash hit.
Somebody had the idea that the TI, Texas Instruments calculator chip, could also be used for games. It worked in calculators, we could make a game out of it. That's where those handheld games came from.
When I first saw it, I'm like, how is this football? Because the field is only this big. How is this 100 yards? And then, of course, you play it and you realize you have to go multiple times to get a touchdown. But oh man, it was great.
The Atari VCS was being sold in toy stores. Mattel did not like giving up shelf space and consumer dollars in toy stores. And I think as much as anything, it's that sense of holding your position, holding market share in the toy industry. That plus the sense that there was a potential here, I think, is what drove the decision.
Mattel saw that Atari was making lots of money, hand over fist, making video games, and decided to make their own console, which they called the Intellivision.
They had an outside consulting group make a set of initial games for the machine for the playtest.
They contracted with a company run by a man named Glenn Hightower to develop the system and develop cartridges for it. So he ran this company, APH Technology Consultants. Mattel found him and contracted him and his company to produce the system and the games. And in 1979, the end of 1979, they test marketed the Intellivision, and then it went full release in 1980.
They test marketed the Intellivision video game console in Fresno, California, and it tested out great. And this was late 1980, and that was when the radio ad got put on the radio. I was actually driving home from work one day, and I heard an ad on the radio, and the ad said, "Do you want to work in the exciting world of video games?" And I didn't know whether to look down at the radio or look up to God if I was being talked to it this way. And would you like to help shape the future of this exciting new entertainment medium? At first, they did not believe that I had been programming video games for 9 years. Eventually, they realized I was telling the truth, and I got hired as one of the original 5 in-house programmers at Mattel. So the original 5 team members at Intellivision on day one were Gabriel Baum, who was our manager, Mike Minkoff, John Soule, myself, Rick Levine. The consultants at APH who had been working on the test market games also continued to stay involved, and they also were working on games in parallel to us. But like modern video game companies, Mattel realized they wanted to control the development themselves, and that's why they built an in-house team. If you were a toy designer, or you worked for the toy company, you turned left and you went into what was then a modern office tower. If you turned right, You went down into where we were, except that was a converted warehouse.
The entire video game division, we were in a separate building. And at lunchtime, we were allowed to walk down this middle corridor to the lunchroom, and everybody's doors in the toy company, all the doors were closed. And it was like, you're not allowed to go into any of those doors. It was very like secret, secret, secret. And then we would go and we'd have lunch and then we'd go back. And one day we're walking down that corridor and some like little like motorized car was zooming around. It was like, oh, there's life, there's a toy, but it went through a door and it closed. And so we were outsiders.
Atari developed this joystick, which is just a stick coming up and you can move it with the Atari in 8 different directions: forward, backward, left, right, and then the 4 diagonals. And that controlled the object on the screen. Mattel decided to go better than that. Mattel controller is a rectangle with this disc on the bottom, a round disc, but 12 buttons over it. Anyway, what the disc was, you can press it in any of 16 directions, and that controlled what goes on the screen. If you're used to a joystick, it's difficult to work with.
I didn't like the controller. I didn't like the controller. I didn't like it.
I mean, a joystick with a button, that feels like a video game. This other one felt like an accounting package.
The Intellivision had the bad interface versus the joystick. Things like that were just things you would argue over all the time.
It felt maybe even like the games were very soft. They weren't edgy.
I'd say visually the Intellivision looked a lot better, but also the 2600, because of its requirement for drawing the screen, meant that every game had to run at 60 frames per second.
Like even today we had discussions like, can we get to 60 frames a second? And like every Atari game that exists is 60 frames a second, because if they didn't, they have to hit that or the screen won't draw, you know? So no Atari game has any sort of lag or anything, because they had no option to have lag.
How many 2600 games were made? 600 in the original few years of the console? That was possible because the software controlled everything, and in the Intellivision, the hardware did what it could do and nothing else.
Out of all the systems I've worked on, the one actually that kind of bested me was the Intellivision, because it's such a unique architecture.
The instruction set for the Intellivision was not an 8-bit instruction set. General Instruments made it 10 bits wide. So when we wrote instructions, we had more opportunities, more things we could do in assembly language because it was 10 bits wide. Basically, it just means we had a book with more pages listing the dictionary of what we could do.
You hear stories about how some engineers just couldn't quite get the Intellivision to do what they wanted. And the reason some of the games are slower is because that understanding of that architecture is very challenging. So games could run really fast on the Intellivision. You just had to do it a certain way. And most people tried to approach programming the Intellivision like they would the Atari 2600 or an old 8-bit computer. They thought that's the way you should do it. But in fact, the Intellivision has a very specific way you should be creating games for it.
So it was made with newer technology. And with that technology, they were capable of making more resolution of backgrounds, more colors, not necessarily better colors, but more sprites. I think they could put 8 sprites on the screen.
The Intellivision itself, because they started work on it about 2 years after Atari had started work on the VCS, it had more advanced chips. And so where the Atari was using a 6502 chip, which is a very basic and because of its simplicity, a powerful chip for its time. We were using a GI 1610 chip, which had 16-bit logic in it as opposed to 8-bit. Everybody says, oh, 8-bit, 16-bit. Well, Intellivision was kind of 3 different kinds of bits. We were very confusing.
The thing is, once we programmers started doing tricks and making the Atari 2600 do things that it was not supposed to do, we ended up with more sprites than the Intellivision. I did a game called Freeway, and Freeway had 10 moving sprites on the screen.
In many cases, a lot of engineers that were on the Atari went to Intellivision and vice versa. And then many engineers that went out to third parties like Activision and whatnot would end up working on multiple platforms. So they'd work on Intellivision and Atari.
I mean, I was at a CES one day showing Pitfall, and the Intellivision programming crew came around. I remember just kind of standing behind them, and they were saying, how do you make a swinging vine that would use all 8 of our sprites? There would be nothing left for Pitfall Harry. And so the swinging vine is a trick. It's a programming trick. and without it, Pitfall doesn't exist.
All the companies in the Bay Area particularly that were working on Atari and Intellivision games were told not to intermingle, not to hang out with people from the other companies because of company secrets being let loose, and nobody wants anybody to know what everybody else is working on.
But occasionally the programmers would run into each other in the mall, and one of them would say, "I finally figured out how you did that thing," you know, or whatever. So there was a little bit of interconnection.
But then hearing that they would all get together for beers at people's houses and play the games they're working on with everybody. And so it was like completely opposite of what they were asked to do. But it was a way for them all to keep sane and also to help each other out. Because once everybody was able to share what they had, even though they weren't supposed to, it really helped everybody understand like how they could improve their games and all stuff with all these great designers in the area.
I'll try almost anything. So when Mattel Electronics asked me to compare their Intellivision games with Atari, I gave it a try.
Mattel started making these commercials with George Plimpton, comparing the two systems.
He was a writer who was brought in as the spokesperson for Intellivision. He would prop up a 2600 game against an Intellivision game and just ask you, basically ask you to tell the difference.
And I think the commercials played that up. You know, as you said, the commercials, you know, implied you were high and mighty if you could afford a Intellivision and you weren't stuck down in the, you know, dregs with your Atari machine.
As a generation of kids and adults were told every night on television by our Intellivision ads, it was a clearly superior video game console.
And so you'd see this like really amazing baseball game on the Intellivision that like in our eyes back then looked like real baseball, and then you see like some blocks over on the 2600 and weird sounds coming out, and baseball talks on the Intellivision, 2600 makes beeps and that sort of thing. So they would beg you to like compare it yourself and make the decision.
I compared Atari baseball with Intellivision and found Intellivision played much more like real baseball.
Where the Intellivision, which cost $100 more than the VCS, where it excelled was in the sports games and great graphics.
Our rival television commercials for Intellivision and Atari ran each night, and inside the company we were tracking sales to see how we were doing, and it was very much competition. And of course we wanted to beat them.
Then they showed the two football games, and the Atari football I've always hated. It doesn't resemble football at all, where the Intellivision version resembles football.
Then I compared Atari football with Intellivision. Again, Intellivision played more like the real game.
The famous Atari game football was like 3-on-3 or 4-on-4, and that was a travesty to football fans. So the Intellivision felt, hey, we can at least, here's a baseball game, you got all the people on the field. Here's a football game, you have a bigger team.
Our emphasis on sports at Intellivision was just recognizing that those were the games that we were doing that people were most responding to. Most of our best sellers were our sports games. And that was the place where we were clearly beating Atari in the marketplace in terms of people's perceptions.
In my opinion, if you try them both, there's only one conclusion you can come to. Intellivision from Mattel Electronics.
The problem was they didn't have any arcade games. And Atari, being an arcade company, excelled in arcade games. And another problem with the Intellivision was it was a slower system than the VCS because it sacrificed memory for graphics rather than for speed. And so Atari retaliated with their own commercial showing this nerdy looking kid and saying, well, here's Atari's arcade games and here's Mattel's arcade games, and there are no Mattel arcade games.
As an intelligent consumer, I wanted to compare Atari Asteroids with other companies' asteroids. But other companies don't make asteroids.
Atari had coin-op games that had great brands that people already knew, and that they could bring those into their home operation. We didn't have that at Mattel. And so we ended up licensing with Data East. But even then we were doing more games that were derivative or copy type. Just to try and keep pace with Atari.
I wanted to compare Atari Missile Command with other companies' missile commands, but other companies don't make that either.
Well, it probably didn't help that Intellivision came from a toy company. There's an aura there of softness, and Atari was, video gaming.
But ultimately, when you played the games, you could really tell the difference then, because the Intellivision and the way it presented graphics, the frame rate was pretty slow. It was pretty plodding, and the 2600 had this really fast frame rate. So games that were like shooters, racing games, all that stuff on the 2600 felt great, but they looked really nice on the Intellivision.
When it comes to the video games the world wants most, nobody compares to Atari.
So in a normal world, the Intellivision would have come along and blown the Atari out of the water because it seemed to have 4 times as much capability. That wasn't the reality. That was only the anticipation.
Despite all the TV commercials that Mattel ran every night for years saying how we were better, we never caught Atari in video game sales because of that price difference.
I'll try almost anything. So when Mattel Electronics asked me to compare their Intellivision games with Atari, I gave it a try. I compared Atari baseball with Intellivision and found Intellivision played much more like real baseball. Then I compared Atari football with Intellivision. Again, Intellivision played more like the real game. In my opinion, if you try them both, there's only one conclusion you can come to. Intellivision from Mattel Electronics.
As an intelligent consumer, I wanted to compare Atari asteroids with other companies' asteroids. But other companies don't make asteroids. I wanted to compare Atari Missile Command with other companies' missile commands. But other companies don't make that either. Finally, I wanted to compare the new Atari Warlords. Unfortunately, other companies don't make it. When it comes to the video games the world wants most, nobody compares to Atari.
Mattel Electronics had no interest in making cartridges for the Atari 2600. What happened was this Glenn Hightower, who made the original cartridges for the Intellivision, he realized he got a bad deal out of it. Whatever games they sold to Mattel, they would get $30,000. Meanwhile, Mattel would turn around and sell like 50,000 copies of the games for a huge amount of money. And so he decided, well, why I should get in on this side. So he had his people reverse engineer the Atari 2600. They started making Atari versions of the Intellivision games.
So I remember when we were in the meeting where we were being told we were going to do this as a company, and we weren't asked, we were told.
It is hard to join a business that there's already 600 products.
Right.
And you're going to try to duplicate
and make a
one
mark.
of them. Yeah.
Yeah. It's pretty hard.
Most of the executives there didn't want to do it. They said, why should we sell games for a competing system? Also, they're worried that people will look down on them, like, they're jumping on the bandwagon for another company. And then Hightower convinced them there's 10 million Atari VCSs out there. There's 2 million Intellivisions out there. So instead of selling games just for 2 million consoles, you could sell games for potentially 12 million consoles. And Mattel liked that idea, and that's why they went with it.
Once video games really started to take off and become this big boom, we had all of these copycat companies trying to come in from the outside, apart from Atari, Mattel, Activision. And everybody was trying to start a video game company. So you had Games by Apollo, which some investors started up. You had the Quaker Oats video game division. And I say that and people think, oh, Don's joking. No, there really was a Quaker Oats video game division. When you have all that kind of stuff going on and people trying to build games for Intellivision and for Atari, at a certain point, I think both companies decided, I don't know who went first or who influenced, well, we should probably be making games for each other because it's now at the point. We make games.
Mattel wants to make Atari games. Everybody has an Atari. We want to sell games. That was what they told us. Atari's everywhere, so let's make games that people will buy because of that.
As the teams evolved and kind of subdivided, one of the factors was those who had experience on 6502, which was quite a few of our programmers at that point. They tended to migrate more towards the VCS, and those who did not certainly were staying on Intellivision.
And I was hired just to do the VCS, nothing else, because I had learned machine language, in college. and the VCS runs on machine language.
Some folks just loved the Intellivision and didn't want to go anywhere. For other people, it was kind of like, oh, we get to go head to head with Atari? That would be fun.
There was that added art part too, of let's be a step above. There was definitely that concept of we're going to be above Astro Smash or whatever those other things are. We're going to be special, high society Atari.
We as a whole, as a group, both M Network and Intellivision, felt like we had really good artists. So when I think about that, what Jane is saying rings true. We were good at combining artists and programmers in a way that brought the best out in both the programmers and the artists.
I was the only woman programmer in the whole group of M Network. I was kind of unaware of how unusual it was. So we were just like a bunch of people, and we all cared about video games and the problems of the VCS and conquering it, and we would share, oh crap, my cycles went too long. I mean, it was a team thing.
Somebody told me, you know that company M Network at CES? That's Mattel. And I said, I don't think so. It doesn't make any sense. And then I found out it was, and I said, oh, okay, so they're giving up.
I just clicked this magazine. It was Electronic Games, but they had this rumor page, and they talked about how Mattel was going to start making games for the Atari 2600. I couldn't get to my friend's house fast enough to be like, victory. Like, there's no way Atari would make games for the Mattel Intellivision, which they would later.
Atari did the same thing. They made games for the Intellivision under the Atari Soft label and other systems too. So there was definitely a lot of back and forth with all these companies once they started cross-selling games across platforms.
But at the time, they were the first to concede, and so I was very excited, not because I wanted the games, which I kind of did, but because I could actually claim victory over my friends that Mattel has to make Atari games to succeed in the game business.
It was just another revenue stream. It was another revenue stream. And it was a good thing for gamers because you could play the games on whichever system you chose.
A lot of their library is based on Intellivision games, and the Intellivision was a pretty capable console. Visually it looked different from the 2600, but a lot of the games had a lot of depth to them.
The cartridge shape was basically the Intellivision cartridge, but then they had this 2600 weird adapter they plugged into it at the bottom, and so they didn't bother. They could have, if you think about it, the tooling for the adapter was probably more than enough to make an actual cartridge case, but the defiance to be like, no, we're going to make a real Intellivision cartridge and make it look and be evocative of Intellivision, even though they're using it on the 2600, I thought was a really interesting approach for them.
When I heard they were coming out with Atari games, I was in the camp that, they know that that's the market leader. We might as well jump on the bandwagon. And there were so many. There must have been at least 2-3 dozen companies at that time producing games for the 2600. So what's another one?
The sports games were fantastic from M Network, and I remember really liking Star Strike on the Intellivision because it felt like the sequence from Star Wars were going to the trench, and that was coming to the 2600. So secretly, I was super excited that I was going to start getting these Intellivision games on the Atari 2600.
The hyped Mattel games like Astro Smash, which became Astro Blast, I like that game. And I think it was better to play on the Atari with the joystick than it was to play on the Intellivision with the disc.
One game I played a lot of, probably more than any others, and it's a weird outlier, is Frogs and Flies, which is a port of Frog Bog. Dark Cavern, a good version of Night Stalker, which should have been my favorite. It's one of my favorites, but it was Frogs and Flies. I played a hell of a lot of Frogs and Flies.
They run the gamut as far as being good and bad, but a lot of them are based on Intellivision titles that didn't already exist on the 2600. So I think it's great that they did that.
They pushed the limits of the Atari 2600. So games like Bump and Jump or Air Raiders or even like their football and baseball games, they were pretty impressive games. They looked really close to their Intellivision counterparts, but also had their own unique look, and they had no compromises. So for a company to kind of come in and just try to cash in on the Atari craze, that isn't what it felt like. It actually felt like they were coming in here to make a difference and make really good, solid Atari 2600 games.
So I like to think that we raised the bar. And then maybe others came along and did way better, who knows? But we cracked it. We said, hey, you don't have to do the old hat stuff. You can play with it like it's an instrument. You can pluck the strings different ways.
It's been noted over the years that when there are at least 2 and sometimes 3 consoles fighting it out is when the video game business is its healthiest.
I think they were only some of the business people for whom it was war. And even though I'm the one who started saying cartridge wars, that was a turn of phrase as a metaphor as opposed to and let's draw blood. But inside the toy industry, they really did think that way. Maybe it was mid-November of '82. And so we do a demo. But the VP of marketing, his fancy suit, sitting there. The VP turns his head very slowly and he looks at me and he goes, "What you have to understand, young man, is that we are at war. We are at war with Atari," which tells you the attitudes of Mattel. "Every sale that we make takes something away from Atari and gives it to us. And even if I can't sell it now, I can stop somebody from buying an Atari now with this game. And that's why we're putting it on television. And you have to understand that this is a war." I don't know if I can get my eyelids as close as low as his, but so we got the speech.
To Atari, it was a console war. To Mattel's Intellivision, it was a console war. To Activision, it was an opportunity.
And as kids, we didn't care at all. You know, I would go over friends' houses to play ColecoVision, and I was amazed. You know, like Donkey Kong was amazing. The controller sucked, but the games were still a blast to play, and we just ignored that. And same thing with Intellivision. Tons of fun games in Intellivision. The controller sucked, but we didn't care. We were having fun playing the games.
It's just ironic that there's much less of a console war now, because, I mean, how many different consoles can you play Call of Duty on? All of them? Right. So it doesn't even work that way anymore. But if you wanted to play a particular game, if you wanted to play Plimpton's Baseball or whatever they called it, you had to have the Intellivision. There was no other way. And that certainly did make it a battle.
If you go back and you look at the old Intellivision and Atari commercials and how they duel in different ways and sometimes make fun of each other and so on, you see the height of it as far as the public was concerned.
It was definitely a console war between the two console makers, but we could use any console we wanted, and in fact would occasionally do that. We would say this game would work so much better on the Intellivision, let's put it over on the Intellivision shelf and work on it when we can. So yes, there was a console war, but there were those of us who benefited from it.
I mean, Atari was so far ahead in sales, I don't think they really worried about Intel. Maybe at first they did, but they were outselling it.
Yes, it was a war, but I think that the money was so heavily on the Atari side that, you know, Mattel was fighting a losing battle out the door.
Atari sold about 27.5 million VCSs. That's between 1977 and 1991. I don't know if that's if the numbers for the Intellivision are from just Mattel Electronics, but their total run was about 3 million.
Well, you know, they say that history goes to the victors. As the guy who coined the term console war, I would say actually that Atari won the first console war, because as much as I hate to say it, we never caught Atari in sales. We never sold as many games, we never sold as many consoles. Making money in this business is something that you have to do in order to keep making games. We're driven by passion, we have a love of making games. In the end, console wars are the business part of it. We as game makers never felt like we were at war. We're just trying to build great games that will sell.
We had Atari Japan that we ended up selling to Namco. Atari Japan actually put Namco in the video game business.
Oh.
Before that, the only thing they did were kiddie rides.
Why did you end up selling it to Namco? What?
Okay, we were young and dumb, and it turns out that in order to establish a business in Japan, you need all kinds of regulations, none of which we did. We actually started it by taking suitcases full of money, cash, and we rented a building, and we hired people.
In Tokyo? Or
in Tokyo.
Oh, man.
And it was a thing where all of a sudden, they kind of started catching up to us, and we thought, okay, this is not good. Maybe we can sell it.
Did you make a profit on the thing?
We actually did.
Nice. All's well that ends well.
Yeah, but it was just, there's an interesting story there too. Pong for the home did not do well in Japan.
Too much space?
Kids wouldn't have their friends over. There wasn't a place. Homes were too small, and so kids would meet in a coffee shop or a karaoke center or something like that, but not at home. So the game that took off in Japan was actually Breakout. That's what established the consumer game market in Japan.
We had a coin-op lab with the current leading coin-op games in it. They're in the VCS division. So we had a Pac-Man coin-op around, and honestly, it didn't really grab me the way Defenders did. Defenders was the game that really sung to me. Bob Pilar remembers this differently than I remember it, but the boss at that time, Dennis Coble, said, okay, there's 2 projects to be done, Pac-Man and Defenders. And Bob said to me, I don't see how to do Pac-Man, so I'll do Defender. The thing that made the dots was what's called Playfield. So Playfield was for, in the 1975 arcade games, was the chunky stuff you were driving around that was static, that was just fixed, that you couldn't change. But you could actually get in on the 2600 and change the playfield on the fly. Now the maze is basically what Playfield was for. Using the playfield for the dots was not what Playfield was for, but we did. It wasn't easy, but basically in the same way you could chop the screen up into vertical slices, you could say, in this slice, when I get to this part of this slice, I'm going to go through and change the background as we go across the screen. But if you actually want to change them during the gameplay, if you want the second half of the screen to be different from the first half of the screen, you actually have to go and rewrite the playfield registers while the electron beam is moving across the screen. And that is doable, and that is how I did the dots. And then after that, we had discovered Flicker. Now, Flicker and Pac-Man is a big deal. One of the things you can do is just say, I've got 2 things that you can draw. 1975, 2 of those was great. Now we had 5 of them on the screen that mattered. Pac-Man has 4 ghosts and a Pac-Man and a fruit, which is actually 6 things that you would call players in some of our parlance, or sprites in normal video game parlance. And they are, they're little cartoon characters. They change across the screen like the dots you're picking up, they're just little pucks, little ones. And there's only 2 of those. So, Flicker happened, right? Flicker happens by saying, I'm going to always play the Pac-Man, and I have 4 ghosts, and I'm going to draw 1 of them every 4th frame. And that's it. And then the ghosts are sitting there, they're on for a frame and off for 3, and then on for a frame and off for 3, and it looks horrible. And people know that. And I do so, and I say, look, they're ghosts. I mean, you could see them, they were good enough. I made this decision in Pac-Man to support the 2-player game. So for me, what I considered to be really important about the coin-op game, and a lot of coin-op games do this, they're 2-player games. You come up, you put in 2 quarters, player 1's up, player 1 gets through however far and then loses, dies. And then player 2 comes up and plays their screen, and when they die, player 1 comes back and their screen is saved where they left off, right? So this is, you're both progressing, basically to see who can get the furthest. Right, so you have to pick up where you left off for that. Storing what your score was, which is not that bad, but where all of the dots were and what level you were on in terms of difficulty, used, I'm going to say, a lot of ROM. And I laugh when I say a lot of ROM because a lot of ROM was like 22 bytes, right? But 22 bytes is a good chunk out of 128. There's 128 bytes of RAM. What's the problem? What are you whining about, Todd? But in that case, that was a decision I made. I really looked forward to people in living rooms having the coin-op experience, having a more social experience than watching another person play the game straight through and then taking turns that way.
I can recount knowing that Pac-Man was coming. We did a pre-order and we went to Sears. I got the Sears Telegames version of it, the black box version. Our whole family hopped in the station wagon. We went to go and we waited in line. We would play 2-player and hand off to the next, because it was my mom, my dad, my brother. And we played this game 2-player quite often, and we had our own kind of tournament kind of going on in the family and everything like that. But when we think about it as a multiplayer game,
it never occurred to me that it didn't have to be a 2-player game.
I love that it was a 2-player game.
But I imagine people sitting on their couch in their living room with their buddy after school playing a game and then going to the other game.
So I had it timed to precision because when I was in school, we had a half-hour lunch, and I lived about 5 minutes away from the school. So my friend and I would run home, and the importance of having a 2-player mode was it kept it fair. Because if one of us just started playing, the other person didn't get a turn.
Right.
And I think that after they just play through all
Until
their lives.
The whole games, right?
Yeah, and so that really sucked. So 2-player mode was essential when you had very time-critical play.
Kind of not just that. I imagine that the whole emotional dynamic of, okay, my turn. I'll see how I do with this life.
Yeah.
And then, okay, now it's my life. And then yours, it's like, and like I get what you just said, the alteration is at a finer grain.
Yeah.
So you both get more kind of, you get maybe the same amount of playtime total.
But we ended up went from a very competitive, when it was just one game at a time, to us actually kind of like cooperatively wanting each person to do really well. I don't know what the psychological reason for that was.
The Friday before the Monday that I started, the Activision crew left. They all just like up and left to form Activision. They wanted their name on the titles and they wanted royalties. So after a year or so, after a couple of years, a bunch of my friends left to form a company, did another Activision. They left to form a company called Imagic. And then one of the Atari engineers got hooked up with a major Hollywood outfit and started talking about doing another Activision Imagic, not a deal where we actually got compensated at like a fraction of the profits of the products we did. You know, like Atari was paying engineers $35,000 a year to make 2 games that sold $500,000 each with a $20 or $15 margin. So they were making bank and paying reasonable salaries for something that actually some of us were the only people who could do at that point at a reasonable rate. And one day I went into my boss's office and I said to him, "George, I really like working here, but it's starting to cost me money." So they created a royalty program. The next week, it was 10 cents a cart, which is a pittance, actually. We were not businessmen. We were software engineers. We were pocket protector, thick glass nerds. We were nerds and burnout hippie nerds, and we were not Steve Jobs. We were not going, no, 10 cents isn't enough. We went, oh, that's great. And that was like in very early March. And then Pac-Man sold 3 million copies in 2 weeks. And in early April, I got a check for $300,000, and that was awesome. So my last name is Frye, F-R-Y-E. And there's a boot company. Someone in coin-op, someone had gotten a big poster for Frye boots and written in large letters at the top, "Why Frye?" And it's there's a thing in logic layout where if you put a line across the top of something, it's a not. So I took a big black pen and put a black line across the top of the Y, because why not Fry? I am the oldest I've ever been. I've got the whole rest of my life ahead of me. It's the longest since those times. And I actually am kind of having some kind of pensive retrospection. It's like I wasn't really attuned to the impact that giving me $1 million had on people who were actually, I'm going to say, this is going to gag coming out of my throat, even more technically capable than I was, who could have done a better job of Pac-Man if that had been their role. And I just, why me? It's just right. The not wrong person at just the right place at just the right time.
First the Pac-Man eats through a maze of dots. Then the Pac-Man heads for the corner spots. Then he eats his fill of a power pill. And then all those ghosts turn blue. Boo! And Pac-Man eats them all too.
Only Atari makes the Pac-Man home video game, and you can only play it on an Atari video game system.
And he played Atari today.
When I play this version of Pac-Man, I actually have some really fond memories of it because I played this game with my dad, and we thought this was the greatest thing ever when it came out. We're big Pac-Man fans. The difference between this and, say, the arcade game, there were obvious differences, of course. Could you maybe elaborate a little bit on why, like what the approach was and why some of these decisions are, say, for instance, like even the play field and the colors versus like the arcade game? What was behind some of that?
There was a rule at Atari that you couldn't use a black background unless you were a space game.
Yeah.
And the reason for that is because these televisions, these CRTs, have phosphorus screens back then, and you could get burn-in.
I was going to say, that still happens today even with OLEDs. I noticed because I've played the Atari on an OLED, and I've played this game called Mousetrap, and it has pure black.
Well, we had a rule, and and again, I've said this, I don't think there's anyone who says, wow, the game is way better with that blue background. But there are a lot of people who say, why isn't the arcade colors? Yeah. That's the answer. And I think it would have been probably better if it had the arcade colors. And what I'm fascinated by looking back is that no one in the signal path between me and out there went, oh, maybe we should give this game a, a pass on that rule. Well, the thing about these video games is that back then it was so new that I don't know, that you could walk up to a game and say what the most important features were. Now, I walked up to this game and said, well, ghosts, Pac-Man, dots, power pills, maze, right? I think there are some things that make Pac-Man Pac-Man.
Yep.
But we didn't know back then how much which less essential features were salient. My father had a pizza shop on Ocean Avenue in San Francisco in like the early 60s. And I used to go there when I was like 7 and 8. And there's this little pharmacy, and they had these comic books, which were great literature abridged versions, right? Of like, I don't know if you've ever seen these, but
I have. I think I know what you're talking about.
It's like, here's Treasure Island.
Exactly.
Here's pick another book whose name I forget.
20,000 Leagues Under the Sea.
20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. War and Peace, which, was 12 pages.
Extremely abridged.
Extremely abridged. And so I thought of this as being that, because we were not going to be able to get, like for instance, Pac-Man has a very distinct process. After I was done with this, I went with Jim Andreasen to Tokyo, to Namco, for them to explain how Pac-Man worked for the 400-800 version.
Yeah.
And each ghost has a separate algorithm for how it moves. When it comes to a decision point, I could never have done that with the amount of RAM and ROM I have. Yeah. Instead of having that algorithm for each player, I'm actually very proud of this. When they come out, I put it all together, and when they came out, all 4 ghosts were totally stuck together the first time I ran it. Because they all went the exact same. And it's like, Whoa, I'm only getting, yeah.
There they go.
And so what I actually did, when Ghost comes to an intersection, it has a choice of moving in your direction or moving randomly. And there's some odds, right, how smart they are. In later levels, actually, the odds that they will move towards you are higher.
Yeah.
And then I take the Ghost numbers, 0, 1, 2, and 3, that's 2 bits. And I take the low order bit and I tweak the odds by which they will move towards you by adding that 1 bit into the percentage of tracking you. That makes them smart and smarter.
And unique personality.
And that's a unique personality. And then I take the second bit and add that to the speed it moves. So each Ghost has a repeatable personality. Each Ghost has a unique personality. This has slightly smarter and slower, slightly smarter and faster, slightly less smart and slower, and it's not this, So they're all, they separate now.
Yeah.
And they each have a perfectly predictable behavior. My Ghosts, their decisions are all made by either a generated signal or your position at that time. So if it comes to an intersection and it's supposed to choose whether to go towards you or away from you, it will be the same choice every time if you have done the same thing up till then. As long as you repeat your pattern, the Ghosts will repeat their pattern, just like in real Pac-Man. And I am really proud of that.
Yeah, it's awesome. Right. Do you remember how many they built to put into distribution?
I've been told, so I know I was paid royalties on $3 million for March.
Okay.
So I know that, I think they may have actually either shipped $3 million worth of boxes to retailers, or retailers may have actually sold at the cash register $3 million. I don't know which. I was paid royalty for like 11 million Pac-Mans.
Oh, wow. You're watching television, there's TV shows on it, could be Friends, it could be like so many TV series, and somebody's playing a video game, they have an Xbox controller, it doesn't matter what they have, but what do you hear when you're watching it? You hear Pac-Man. It's either Pac-Man or Donkey Kong.
You hear this Pac-Man.
You hear this Pac-Man, and that gonk, gonk, gonk sound. Like, these sounds, you created all these sounds in this game.
I created all of these sounds.
How do you feel when you hear this?
It's actually really interesting, because really thinking about it, what that means is that for our generation, the 11 to 15 million copies that went out, actually, people who are making those soundtracks think people will relate to this sound. This is like...
It's become the video game sound.
It's become the video game sound, but it was the video game sound.
Yeah.
I mean, this is really the breakthrough video game that went from games selling 100,000, maybe 1 in 10 games or 1 in 20 games might sell 1 million.
Yeah.
To it sold 10 million.
It's crazy.
It's the explosion.
I want to thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for attending the 3rd International Conference on Science and Technology. This afternoon,
what the heck is that?
Well, I don't know, but that's another one.
Good gracious, there goes another one.
They're multiplying.
Interrupt this program to bring you a special bulletin. Mysterious underground creatures are moving your way.
We have a problem here.
Come on, everybody, take a chance. We're going underground to do the dig dug dance. First you tunnel through a wall of dirt, follow under rocks without being hurt. Quick now, turn around, what do you do?
For that, nothing.
Running after you. Dig dug, dig dug, dig dug. あれ見て見てもしもしあれ
Here, look at here. Look at see.
Lays down deep in the ground. When a flower sprouts up, you play another round, but you gotta have an airtight.
Where are your women now, huh? Where are your women now?
As your score gets higher, they multiply.
All right, let's get cracking. Oh, you always want to come on. Spider, and Dig Dug.
What do they do? What happened? Eat all that cheese and
All they want is for us to play with them so we can all have a lot of fun. A lot of fun.
Dig Dug's the greatest spider of them all. Dig Dug! Dig Dug! Dig Dug! Dig Dug!
Galaxian warriors, today we're going up against the most feared commander, and everyone counts, even you, Quid.
Man your ships, man your ships, man your ships. We're going in! Assume attack formation. All wings ready, sir. Okay, I'm peeling off. Cover me, cover me!
Roger on that, Blue Leader.
Heavy fire, 17 degrees. Affirmative.
This guy's good.
Watch your back.
We lost Blue Leader.
I'm hit. Who's left?
Quid.
No!
Quid, you're a credit to your cartridge. Galaxian, the arcade hit, now for the Atari 2600 system.
The job at General Computer was actually my first job. You know, they had just inked a deal with Warner, Atari's parent at the time, to do a whole bunch of games, and they didn't have enough people to do it. So, you know, they were happy to find more people. And they said, you know, can you program something with 128 bytes of RAM? And I thought they meant 128K, which was a reasonable amount at the time, only to find out later when I showed up that it was much smaller. And it was a great experience. One of the reasons that Warner came to General Computer was they thought that they would get a more professional atmosphere and work product. But again, there was fun. We had a fire pole to get from the second floor to the first floor. We had an arcade. We played games on our coffee breaks. You know, everybody was really top notch. In '83, GCC hired more MIT graduates than any other company besides IBM and Xerox. So everybody was really good. And I was one of the oldest people. I think I was all of 27 or something. Glenn Parker was actually part of that team as well. For Galaxian, it was just Glenn and myself. Glenn was a great programmer, and he was doing the gameplay. I was doing the graphics part because I wanted to learn how to do that. You know, we could ask each other questions or whatever, and he was sitting right in back of me, or I guess on the other side of me. And so we could bounce things off of each other on a constant basis. There was also 𝐏𝐿𝐿 who did the music and some of the early graphics, because I can't draw and I can't do music. The music is actually really hard on the Atari 2600 because it's not a full octave. She had to kind of skip parts to make it sound right. So that was really great that she could do that. I don't know how long that would have taken us to do it. The other problem, though, was that the graphics on the Atari couldn't really handle the number of sprites that were available in the actual Galaxian. So if you remember Space Invaders, it was really only 6 across because that was the standard thing. I will give, again, I'll give myself a little credit here, but I managed to discover through, again, kind of random luck, a way to get 8 things on a line and be able to turn them off and on. And that was really just hacking the code and freaking out the chip so that it did things that weren't part of the spec. And that's, I think, what really made the game. And then, of course, we went to the Consumer Electronics Show where it was shown for the first time. And it was, again, quite an ego stroke to kind of stand there and watch the programmers from other companies come and go, how did they do that? And so, you know, that I was kind of standing off to the side so I could kind of watch. So, you know, I think Patty did a really nice job with the music and the sound effects, and the visuals were at least looked real. And, you know, the graphics weren't as chunky as they were on earlier games. I mean, Atari gave it to us at GCC because they thought it was an impossible cartridge. And so, you know, to be able to come back and say, oh, by the way, we figured out how to make it work was really a big win.
It's not termites. It isn't mice. It's Dig Dug, the new video game cartridge from Atari, console sold separately and hooked up by an adult. You dig for balloon men.
Yeah.
You dig for dragons. You can dig yourself into all sorts of trouble. The question is, can you dig yourself out? Dig Dug, the Atari video game cartridge. Versions available for all Atari systems. Consoles sold separately.
We were doing things that weren't possible. Xevious was not possible. I was the third engineer assigned Xevious. I was working on my Sword Quest Air World, 𝐀𝐭𝐫𝐬 based game, and they asked someone to do Xevious. He said, I can't do that. And they gave it to someone else for a couple of weeks. Again, I won't name names. He said, I can't do that. So they said, Todd. And I did something, but it was not possible. There was not a snowball's chance in hell of making Xevious work on the Atari 2600. So what we had to do was find the essence. Polaris Defender captures the essence of Defender. You can tell it's Defender. It's got a lot of flicker. Pac-Man captures the essence of Pac-Man. You can tell it's Pac-Man. It's got a lot of flicker. Xevious has the scrolling background, which is totally doable, and it's got something like up to 20 moving objects on the screen without flicker. They're all in little horizontal slices. But it's not only they're in horizontal slices, but they're actually in 2 horizontal slices scrolling over each other at different speeds. And that is awesome. It's like, it is an awesome piece of software that captured the essence. So what is it that's fun about that? It's like, so Xevious has a lot of stuff going on in the air. And there's a lot of different things that can be flying at you fast. And then it also has things going on the ground. So you have 2 planes, 2 time, you got these tanks on the ground that you can shoot with ground shooting bullets. You got these things in the sky that you can shoot with sky shooting bullets. You don't have to worry about running into the things on the ground, but they might shoot at you. And you do have to worry about dodging. It's fast. This is what made Xevious appealing at that time. People had learned enough about playing these games that they could effectively play 2 games at the same time. Shoot the thing on the ground and dodge from and shoot the things in the sky, which maybe people would not have. Actually, it's funny to think about again. Weird. 10 years earlier, 5 years earlier, 7 years earlier, when combat was the game, people might not have been able to play Xevious. I invented a way to intertwine multiple display drivers on this 2600 screen. I did this for Rob Dibbles' NFL football game, where we wanted the players in their little horizontal slices, right? But I wanted 2 horizontal slices. I wanted 1 horizontal slice for the blue team and 1 horizontal slice for the red team. I stayed until 1 o'clock that morning, and I left it on Rob's screen so that when he came in, there were 2 sets of objects vertically scrolling, X's and O's, red X's and blue O's, going like this because they're running on completely separate screens, they thought. The red screen was keeping track of its vertical positions and was completely separated from the blue screen, but they were intertwined. So if you turn the blue screen off, the red screen would be going like this. You turn the red screen off and put the blue screen on, it'd be going like this. You put both on and they're going like that. And it's really cool. I mean, it was a eureka moment. But in Xevious, I needed something like 3 or 4 separate sets of objects. There's stuff coming down and shooting at you. And you need my shots going up. And you need the ground moving down and the things moving on the ground. Yeah, miscellaneous, nightmarish wizardry in there. I mean, I get a really high moving, get a really high graphics complexity count up there on Xevious for the 2600. I used everything for the moving objects. Right? Gray tanks moving across the ground, all kinds of different stuff flying in the sky. Those were all in one sprite, and they were vertically separated, but if you separate them across enough, it kind of looks like a bunch of stuff. You can't quite tell that there's only one stream of them coming. If there's some over here and some over here, and they're moving like this, it looks plenty complex. but I was out of things. I have to keep track of where the player is. And what I decided to do was to use a 4-bit wide missile and horizontally position it just a little bit to make it a little bit of a comma, upside down comma shape, and then flip it the next screen. It flickered to be an upside. So I made kind of an upside down V ship out of the single bit of the missile. That's the ship. It's the missile. In the same way, that's funny, in the same way that I made the fruit out of a ball and a missile. I mean, this is how close you are to scraping the bottom of the barrel when you're doing impossible coin-op conversions on the Atari 2600. Oh, I'll make a piece of graphics that in the coin-op is a sweet-looking little cherry. I will make out of a blue block with a orange block inside of it. And that seemed like a good idea at the time, and it was. And I will take a single pixel of graphics and make it into a V-shaped ship. It's like, that is like really reaching down to the very last drop.